"Hey, you, the black girl in the back, step forward." The words cut through the quiet auditorium like metal striking glass, sharp enough to make 500 people turn at once. And for a moment the rustle of programs and whispered conversations collapsed into a single, focused silence. A narrow beam of light slid across the rows until it settled on her. A small 11-year-old girl in a faded uniform and worn-out shoes, her hands trembling at her sides, not from weakness, but from the shock of suddenly being seen by every pair of eyes in the room. The man on stage took his time crossing the space toward her, each step echoing against polished wood, his microphone tilted beneath a smile that looked warm from a distance and cold up close. "Let's find out if you're actually worth the seat you're standing in, or if someone else should have been here instead." A ripple of laughter rolled through the auditorium, the kind people tell themselves is harmless, the kind that pretends to be part of the show. But it moved around her instead of through her, and she did not join it. She didn't shrink back into the darkness. She didn't hide behind her hands. She lifted her chin just enough that the light caught the edge of her face, not in defiance, not in challenge, simply because she refused to vanish. In that fragile second, the room didn't yet understand what it was looking at. A child under a spotlight, yes, but also something quieter, steadier, like a line of thread pulled tight through fabric. He stopped in front of her, bending slightly, his voice lowering into a register meant only for the first few rows and anyone close enough to see that the smile didn't reach his eyes. The orchestra behind him waited, frozen mid-breath. A camera at the back of the room adjusted its focus with a soft mechanical sigh. Somewhere, a woman stopped clapping halfway through the motion and kept her palms suspended in the air as if she, too, was afraid to move. The girl's fingers curled for a moment, then steadied, as though she had found something invisible to hold on to. She could feel the weight of the room pressing inward, the lights humming faintly above her, the velvet curtains absorbing every small sound, and she knew that if she let this moment shape her, it would shape her into something smaller than she was meant to be. She breathed in carefully, the way she did when she had to walk alone down long hallways or answer questions, asked in voices that already expected her to be wrong, and she realized that what frightened her wasn't the man, or the crowd, or the light. It was the possibility of becoming exactly who they imagined. He angled the microphone toward her mouth, inviting her to fill the silence he'd created, and for a split second the entire auditorium hovered between two futures, the one where she stumbled and the one where she didn't. The laughter faltered, not because anyone felt guilty yet, but because they sensed that the moment was not going where they'd expected. Her eyes didn't harden. They didn't plead. They simply stayed, steady and present, as if she were standing in a doorway that someone else had tried to close on her, and she had quietly placed her foot there instead. A boy in the balcony leaned forward over the railing. A stagehand in the wings stopped moving a prop and forgot to put it down. Even the man on stage blinked, just once, surprised that the script in his head wasn't unfolding as smoothly as usual. She didn't rush to defend herself. She didn't try to impress him. She let the silence breathe, let the room hear itself, let the light rest on the uneven truth that there was nothing funny about a child being made to stand alone beneath it. And in that pause, so thin and delicate that it almost slipped past unnoticed, something shifted. The power in the space bent, not loudly, not dramatically, but the way a compass needle turns when it finds north. She opened her mouth, not to apologize, not to explain, but to speak in the same voice she used when she wanted to be understood instead of approved of, and for reasons none of them could name yet, the people in that theater leaned in. The laughter died in the back rows, hands that had been rising with phones lowered halfway. The man's smile tightened, just a fraction, as if he could feel the stage tilt beneath his feet and didn't know why. And though no one could see it clearly from where they sat, the smallest change had already taken place. In the space where a child was supposed to shrink, she had remained exactly her size. That was all, and it was enough to make everyone in that room realize, whether they admitted it yet or not, that they had chosen the wrong person to humiliate. She had not always known how to stand still beneath a light like that. The strength that steadied her in that moment had been stitched together from smaller hours and quieter rooms and if the people in the auditorium could have followed the thin thread of her courage backward, they would have found it beginning earlier that afternoon, when the day still smelled faintly of dust and cleaning solution, and the faint metallic breath of stage cables warming under electricity. Hours before the spotlight found her, she sat on a wooden bench in the hallway, outside the rehearsal doors, her feet barely touching the floor, listening to the low murmur of adults' voices echoing along the tiled corridor. Her mother had been working in the back rooms of the building since morning, not in the glamorous parts with velvet curtains and polished floors, but in the spaces that held crates and tape and folding chairs, places where sound arrived late and applause might as well have belonged to another world. The girl had waited quietly, tracing the frayed edge of her sleeve with her thumb, feeling the coarse threads like a small map beneath her skin, and each time someone passed by in a hurry with a headset or clipboard, she made herself smaller in the hallway so they wouldn't have to step around her. Her mother had leaned out from a doorway once, tucking an escaped strand of hair back under her cap, and smiled the tired smile that always seemed to apologize for not being able to sit beside her longer. "Stay close," she had whispered, the words gentle but carrying the weight of worry, and the girl had nodded, because she always did. The clock above the exit sign had seemed to move faster in some moments and slower in others, its red digits shifting like breaths, and each time the rehearsal room door opened, snatches of music or laughter spilled into the hall before being swallowed again. She had heard footsteps, polished and confident, the kind of steps that belonged to people who were accustomed to being watched, and when the man who would later call her forward walked past her for the first time, she had not yet known his name, only the way the air around him changed, as though it had learned to move with him instead of against him. He didn't see her then, or if he did, he saw only the uniform, the smallness, the way she folded her hands in her lap to keep from fidgeting, and in that passing she learned something she had already suspected, that invisibility was often not a gift, but a decision other people made for you. When the rehearsal paused and her mother pressed a small paper cup of water into her hands, the girl had turned it slowly, watching the way the light from the hallway fixture trembled along its rim, and that was when she reached into her bag and touched the thin notebook she carried everywhere. It was not filled with songs or drawings, but with pieces of other people's words, fragments she had written down because they felt like anchors in days that might otherwise sweep her away. Her grandmother's sentence from a winter morning, when the heat had gone out. A line the church pianist had murmured when no one else was listening. A note from a kind teacher who had once told her that being quiet did not mean being small unless someone else decided it for you. The notebook had felt warm in her palm, as if every voice inside it had leaned a little toward her, and for several minutes she sat very still, as though she might memorize the feeling of that steadiness and tuck it away for later. Later came sooner than she expected. A stagehand had asked her mother to help move boxes into the side wing, and the girl had followed at a careful distance, stopping when she reached the place where the hall gave way to shadows and colored light. From there she could see a thin sliver of the stage, not enough to understand the choreography of the rehearsal, but enough to sense its scale. The wide arc of the room, the way sound seemed to stretch before coming home again. She had stood there listening, not intruding, simply existing near the edge of something important, and that was when she heard the man's voice rise and fall, in a tone that wasn't cruel, but wasn't gentle either, a tone that assumed the world would bend to accommodate it. People laughed on cue. The band paused and began again. The girl's mother called her name softly to remind her not to lean too far forward, and she stepped back, feeling the rough grain of the wall through the thin fabric of her blouse, grounding herself with its solidness. She thought then, not in grand or dramatic words, but in the practical language of a child who has already learned to survive small humiliations, that rooms like this were never built for people like her to belong in them. And yet something inside her resisted that conclusion, like a knot refusing to come undone. When they left the wings and returned to the hallway, the girl slipped her notebook back into her bag, but the sense of that knot, tight and stubborn, remained. Hours passed. The sky outside transitioned from afternoon to a muted dusk that bled gently into evening, and the building woke up as if it had been waiting for darkness to find its voice. Guests arrived in careful shoes and careful smiles. Ushers guided them into seats lined in red fabric that caught the light like small embers. The girl sat beside her mother for a little while before the doors closed, the warmth of her mother's arm brushing against her shoulder through the thin sleeve, and when her mother had to return backstage, she whispered the same words as before, but this time they sounded different, like a wish rather than a warning. "Stay close." The program began. Music poured across the room in waves that the girl could feel before she could name. She watched from her seat, quiet and attentive, neither leaning forward eagerly nor slumping back with boredom, simply absorbing the sound like rain through open soil. She did not expect anything to involve her. She did not imagine herself part of what unfolded under the scattered beams of light. She was content to observe, to learn what it looked like when the world allowed someone else to fill it. That was why, when the man's gaze swept the audience and paused where she sat, the moment struck her less like a surprise and more like a test she had never agreed to take. She felt the shift, the air turning dense, the people around her stirring with curious excitement, and in the second before he spoke, she knew two things at once: that he was about to choose her, and that how she carried herself afterward would matter in ways no one else would understand. The memories of the hallway, the wings, the notebook, her mother's tired smile. They didn't rush through her like a montage. They settled into place quietly, forming a small, steady platform beneath her feet. So when his words sliced through the air and the spotlight dropped onto her shoulders like unexpected weight, she did not stand because he wanted her to. She stood because remaining seated would have trapped her in an even smaller space, one she could not live inside. As she rose, she felt her knees tremble and her stomach twist, but she also felt the knot inside her tighten again, not painful, just present, reminding her that dignity could exist in a child's body the same way it existed in any other, not loud, not demanding, not defiant, simply unwilling to disappear. And though no one else could see it, the path that carried her from that wooden bench in the hallway to the unforgiving center of the stage was not a leap, but a line, pulled carefully, patiently, through every hour of that long day until it reached this moment where the quiet strength she had gathered finally had somewhere to stand. From where she stood beneath the light, the world narrowed into a corridor of sound and breath and watching eyes, and though the people in the audience could not see how the day had threaded itself into this moment, they could feel it in the way the room shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, as if a great, unseen wheel had begun to turn. The orchestra waited behind the man on stage, their instruments resting in careful silence, while cameras mounted near the back adjusted and locked into place with the soft mechanical click that meant this instant was no longer only for the people in the room. Somewhere along the left aisle, a woman leaned toward the person beside her and whispered, then stopped halfway through the sentence because even her own voice felt too loud now. The girl sensed all of it without fully understanding time the way adults did. She knew only that every second here was stretching longer than it should, that every breath lasted twice as long as the one before it, and that the space between the man's grin and the microphone he angled toward her felt like a doorway she had not asked to walk through. He spoke again, this time not teasing so much as testing, his tone balanced carefully between amusement and control, the kind of voice that made the room assume whatever happened next would still belong to him. "We're all waiting," he said, and the words fluttered across the rows like a flock of small, uneasy birds. The audience chuckled again, softer this time, a polite sound people made when they weren't sure whether to be entertained or concerned, and more than one person lifted a phone, not cruelly, not intentionally, just reflexively, as if the act of recording might protect them from the discomfort of witnessing. The girl did not look at the phones or the faces or even the glittering jacket sleeve hovering inches from her shoulder. She looked at the floorboards just long enough to anchor herself in the narrow seams between them, then lifted her gaze, tracing the path of the light until it disappeared into the high darkness above the stage. In that darkness, she imagined a quiet place, almost like the hallway from earlier, a place where nobody laughed or pointed or waited for her to stumble, and she carried the calm of that imagined space back down into her chest. The man shifted slightly, perhaps feeling the stillness thicken around them, and gestured toward the band, as though he might propel the evening forward by sheer momentum. A pianist's fingers hovered over the keys, uncertain, waiting for instruction. A violinist swallowed hard and lifted her bow a fraction of an inch. The conductor glanced from the man to the girl and back again, his hand frozen mid-air like a bird suspended on a wire. It was a strange kind of escalation, not loud or theatrical, but internal, like a tide creeping higher with every heartbeat, and as it rose, the people who had come expecting a comfortable show found themselves sitting with a discomfort they didn't have a name for yet. In the balcony, an older man in a pressed suit frowned, not in disapproval, but in recognition, as if he had once stood under a light like that and remembered how it felt. Near the front row, a teenager pressed her palms together and held them beneath her chin, eyes wide and unblinking, as though she were afraid that if she looked away, the moment would vanish and be replaced by something easier to understand. The girl's hands trembled again, but not the same way they had before. This time the tremor was smaller, contained, like a bird folding its wings. She could feel the man's presence beside her, the confidence, the expectation, the certainty that whatever he initiated others would follow. And for one thin moment she almost stepped into the role the room had carved for her, the frightened child, the harmless interruption, the lesson everyone forgot by tomorrow morning. But that knot inside her, the one that had held steady through hallways and doorways and hours of waiting, tightened gently, reminding her that shrinking was not the same as surviving, and that silence could be its own kind of wound. The man leaned in, microphone poised, prepared to guide her toward whatever performance would amuse the crowd without threatening him. Yet even he sensed something subtle had shifted, because he hesitated, and in that hesitation, she found the breathing room she needed. She did not speak yet. She let the pause stretch, thin but strong, like glass drawn into a thread, and the audience, whether they realized it or not, leaned forward together, pulled toward her by curiosity rather than spectacle. The laughter didn't disappear entirely. It softened into a guilty echo, like a sound people wished they had not made. Someone cleared their throat and immediately regretted it. Even the lights humming faintly overhead seemed to lower their voices. The man tried once more to steer the moment, his smile regaining a trace of its earlier shine, as he gestured toward her with a flourish that told the room he still believed he controlled the story. "Go ahead," he said lightly. "Show us something." But when she finally lifted her eyes to his, there was no confrontation there. No challenge, no fear he could easily exploit. There was simply presence, quiet, unyielding, and impossibly steady for someone so small. She remembered the notebook tucked inside her bag backstage, the words she had gathered and carried like lanterns through darker corridors, and though it wasn't in her hands now, it felt as if every page had opened at once inside her chest, lending her the courage to remain exactly where she was. A murmur rolled across the audience, not quite panic, not quite anticipation. Something closer to awareness, as if they were only now realizing that whatever this was, it was no longer a trick or a joke or a harmless diversion. This was a child, being measured by the weight of a grown man's performance, and the scales did not sit comfortably in anyone's heart. Someone in the upper rows dropped their program and did not bend to pick it up. The conductor lowered his hand. The pianist rested both palms quietly on the keys. No music came, and yet the room had never felt more full of sound. It was in that fullness, in that swelling tension between what the audience thought they came to watch and what they were actually witnessing, that an unexpected ally revealed themselves, not with words, not with movement, but with a small act of stillness. A woman seated at the edge of the stage, part of the backstage staff, stopped what she was doing and folded her arms across her chest, her expression no longer neutral, but watchful, protective in a way she might not even have understood. The girl saw it, or perhaps simply felt it, the faint shift in how the room regarded her, and that knowledge steadied her more than anything the man could say or threaten. The test was still there, the pressure intact, but it no longer felt like a trap closing. It felt like a line being drawn, thin but unmistakable, between making someone small and allowing them to remain whole. She drew a slow breath, one that filled her ribs rather than collapsing them inward, and the moment at last tipped from anticipation into whatever came next. The man's smile faded just enough that those in the first rows saw the uncertainty bloom across his face, and though he did not retreat, he no longer leaned quite so close. The entire auditorium seemed to arrive at the same realization at the same time. This wasn't a performance anymore. It was a reckoning, quiet and human, unfolding in real time under a circle of light, that had been meant to expose her, but had instead begun to expose them all. The reckoning did not arrive with raised voices or sharp gestures. It came instead in a slow, sinking way, like the feeling of an elevator pausing between floors, leaving everyone inside unsure of whether they were rising or falling. The man on stage sensed the change first, not because he was particularly perceptive, but because he was used to guiding every room he entered, and now the room was no longer moving with him. His smile stiffened, his jaw tightening just enough to make the shadows along his cheekbones deepen, and he turned slightly toward the audience, as if to reclaim them, to fold them back into his embrace before they slipped away. "All right," he said with a light laugh and that sounded rehearsed even to his own ears. "We don't need to make this dramatic. Just a little moment, a learning experience." The words drifted outward with the fragile confidence of something that expected agreement, but the laughter that rose in response was thinner than before, threadbare around the edges, like fabric that had been stretched too far. He shifted again, and the microphone dipped toward the girl, not gently, not harshly, but with the subtle insistence of someone who had decided that whatever hesitation existed must now be overcome. The orchestra stirred uneasily. A few bows lifted, a brass player cleared his throat, waiting for a cue that never quite arrived. The conductor's hand hovered a few inches above his side, neither raised nor lowered, caught in a limbo that mirrored the suspended air between the two figures beneath the light. The girl felt that suspension most of all. Where the earlier moments had felt like a tide swelling beneath her feet, this one felt like the sea pulling away from the shore, exposing the fragile ground beneath everything she had been standing on. Her stomach tightened, her breathing turned shallow, and for the first time since she'd stepped forward, a flicker of doubt passed through her. Not about who she was, but about whether she belonged in this particular moment, on this particular stage, inside a story she had never chosen. She could feel the audience shifting, a collective, restless movement that whispered through velvet seats and polished shoes, and in that movement she sensed a hunger for resolution, for things to return to their expected shape, for her to say something small and safe so that everyone else could relax again. The man must have felt it too, because his voice grew firmer, softer in tone, but heavier in weight, the way adults sometimes speak when they want to sound patient, while making it clear that patience is almost gone. "Go on," he murmured, close enough now that she could smell the faint scent of his cologne beneath the hot metallic breath of the stage lights. "Just a few words, that's all." The words should have sounded gentle. They didn't. They sounded like a door being nudged shut from the other side. Her hands trembled more visibly now, the tiny muscles along her wrists fluttering like moth wings, and for a moment she imagined retreating, stepping back out of the circle of light, letting the moment collapse around someone else. There was no shame in leaving, she told herself. Children were allowed to walk away from things that hurt. But she also knew something quiet and painful. If she left now, the story of this moment would not disappear. It would simply be told without her. She would become a small anecdote in other people's retellings, a shrug, a laugh, a reminder that some people are not built for certain rooms. And that hurt worse than the fear. The audience could not see the shape of that choice inside her, but they felt its weight anyway. A woman in the third row pressed her lips together, regret softening her features. A man near the aisle lowered his phone completely and let it rest in his lap. The laughter had vanished now, replaced not by respect yet, but by an uneasy recognition that something had tipped too far, that the line between entertainment and cruelty had thinned to the point of breaking. The man sensed their discomfort and tried to fill it, spreading his arms, performing warmth, his words turning broader, louder, as if volume alone could rewind the evening. "Let's help her along, shall we?" he called toward the orchestra, but his voice cracked faintly at the end, betraying a tension he hadn't intended to reveal. The pianist, who had been waiting in silence, glanced at the conductor, then at the girl, then back at the keys, and in that tiny hesitation, another truth surfaced. Not everyone on that stage was comfortable anymore. The conductor gave a small nod, one that technically signaled readiness, but carried none of the confidence it was meant to convey. The pianist placed her fingers on the keys, and then nothing happened. Or rather, something happened that felt like nothing. The pianist did not play. She simply rested there, hands hovering, eyes lowered, as if some instinct deeper than training told her that to begin would be to participate in something she did not believe in. The stillness spread outward like a quiet rebellion. A violinist lowered her bow. A percussionist loosened their grip on a mallet. No one spoke. No one defied. They simply did not move. The man's smile fractured again, this time plainly visible. "Come on," he said, half laughing, half command. "Let's not be difficult. We're waiting." But he was the only one who sounded impatient. Everyone else sounded aware. And in that awareness, the girl felt the tide shift again. Not in her favor, not fully, but away from the certainty that she would break. It was then, at the very height of this fragile tension, that the lowest point reached her. Not from the man, not from the crowd, but from the memory that rose unbidden from somewhere deep inside. For a moment, she was no longer on the stage, but standing in a dim grocery store aisle months ago, listening to a cashier speak to her mother in a voice that made simple words feel like judgments. She remembered the way her mother's shoulders had tightened, how she had apologized for taking too long to count the bills, how the world had kept moving while they stood there shrinking in plain sight. That memory washed over her like cold water, and for a heartbeat she felt very small again. Small in the way that made even breathing feel like trespassing. The knot inside her loosened. Her knees wavered. Her gaze dropped toward the floorboards, and the audience held its breath, sensing the collapse before it happened. Someone whispered, "It's all right," too softly for anyone but the nearest seats to hear. The man leaned closer, victory flickering faintly in his eyes, because this was the moment he recognized, the moment where discomfort could be neatly resolved by submission. "Just say something," he said, gentler now, but only because he believed the moment was his again. And for a second, a long, trembling second, she almost did. Almost let the moment shrink her into the smallest possible version of herself, the one that fit comfortably inside other people's expectations. But then, like a thread tightening again through fabric, another memory rose, quieter, softer, almost invisible. Her grandmother's voice at the kitchen table, the one that had been written in the notebook she carried. "You can be quiet without disappearing." It was not a weapon. It was not defiance. It was simply a truth she had needed once, and needed now. The tremor in her hands did not vanish, but it steadied into something else. Not confidence, not power, endurance. She lifted her head, just barely, and the light caught her face again. Not brighter, not stronger, simply present. And that small act changed the room's balance more profoundly than any speech could have. Because for the first time since the man had called her forward, it was clear that while she might be afraid, she was not surrendering. The lowest point passed, thin as a blade's edge, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt like a choice. And one by one, not dramatically, not heroically, the people in the room began to feel the cost of what they had expected from her. The weight of it did not fall on her shoulders anymore. It fell on theirs. The silence that followed was not empty. It was dense, layered with realization, with the faint rustle of people shifting in their seats, not out of impatience, but out of a dawning awareness that something in the room had reoriented, that the story unfolding beneath the light was no longer the one they had come prepared to watch. The man on stage sensed it too, though he did not yet understand its shape. His smile had become a fragile thing, a performance stretched thin across a face that was no longer entirely sure of its audience, and for a few seconds he simply stood there, suspended between insisting on control and retreating from a moment that no longer felt safe for him to hold. The girl, still trembling but upright, felt the wave of vulnerability pass through her and ebb, leaving behind a strange steadiness that did not feel like bravery or triumph, only like truth that had decided to remain. She did not speak immediately. She allowed the silence to breathe, to fill the room with its weight, and in that breath, something subtle but unmistakable began to shift among the witnesses who had, until then, been content to watch from the edges. Near the wing, the woman from the backstage staff, the one who had folded her arms earlier without quite knowing why, took a small step forward, not onto the stage, not into the spotlight, but just enough that her presence felt closer, like a hand resting invisibly against the back of the girl's shoulders. A member of the orchestra, a violinist with silver threaded through her hair, let her bow drop fully into her lap and looked straight at the man. Not with anger, not even with challenge, but with a quiet question that made his breath falter. And in the front row, a man who had earlier lifted his phone and recorded without thinking, now slowly lowered it, turned the screen face down, and in doing so seemed to acknowledge, if only to himself, that this moment was no longer something he wished to capture, but something he was responsible for witnessing. The girl noticed none of these gestures directly, but she felt them all the same, as if the air around her had thickened not to trap her, but to hold her up. She drew in a breath that reached deeper than any she had taken since stepping into the light, and when she finally lifted her head and opened her mouth, her voice came out small, not theatrical, not resonant, but steady. Each word shaped with care, as though she understood that whatever she chose to say would travel farther than she would ever be able to follow. "I don't want to perform for you," she said, and the sentence hovered there, fragile and unadorned, so honest that it startled even those who had begun to root for her. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't rebellion. It was simply a child drawing a boundary where no one had expected one to appear. The man blinked, caught off guard by the softness of it, because he had prepared himself for either collapse or confrontation, not for refusal spoken with dignity. "This is a chance," he replied quickly, his voice straining for warmth he no longer truly felt. "Opportunities don't always come around twice." He meant to sound benevolent, guiding, generous. Instead, his words echoed strangely against the walls, revealing more about him than about her. The girl tilted her head slightly, and for the first time she looked not only at the man, but past him, at the orchestra, at the stagehands, at the faces in the dark rows who were beginning to realize that they were not spectators, so much as participants in what was unfolding. Her hands loosened at her sides, as if some invisible weight had slipped from her wrists. "I came here to listen," she said softly, and the people who had heard those words earlier in the night, those who had leaned forward when she first spoke, felt a thread tighten between then and now, tying the earlier moment to this one. "But when you called me up here, it didn't feel like listening anymore." The words did not accuse him. They did not shame him. They simply described a truth that everyone in the room had already felt, whether they had admitted it or not. The violinist's shoulders softened. The pianist lowered her hands fully onto the keys and closed her eyes, not to play, but as if in acknowledgement. Somewhere in the balcony, someone whispered, "She's right," with the hesitant reverence of a confession. The man swallowed, his jaw working, and for the first time since the evening had begun, he had no ready script to fall back on. The microphone sagged slightly in his hand. He started to speak, then stopped. And in the pause that followed, the girl reached into the pocket of her faded uniform, her fingers moving carefully, as though she were handling something delicate. When she withdrew her hand, she was holding the thin notebook that had traveled with her through hallways and hours in quiet rooms, its edges worn soft from being opened and closed more times than anyone could count. The theater did not gasp. It didn't need to. An attentive hush rolled across the rows like a tide settling into place, and every eye followed the small object, as if it, too, stood beneath the light. The girl looked down at its cover for a long second, then opened it to a page marked by a fold near the corner. She did not lift it high or present it to the crowd. She simply glanced at the words inside, grounding herself in their familiarity, then spoke again, not reading, not quoting, but carrying the spirit of what lived there. "I wrote things people said," she murmured, her voice barely more than breath. "Kind things, sad things, things that music helped them get through. They came here because it made them feel less alone." The room tightened around that statement as if drawn inward by gravity. The witnesses, the orchestra, the staff, the audience, were no longer watching a child under scrutiny. They were listening to someone name the deeper purpose of the very space they occupied. She closed the notebook gently, pressing her palm over its cover as though to keep the voices inside safe. "I don't think anyone should be made to feel small here," she said at last, and the sentence arrived not like a blow, but like a mirror quietly turned around. It did not humiliate. It did not condemn. It simply showed the room what it had become. and what it could choose not to be. The man stared at her, and for the first time his expression softened, not in performance, but in something closer to recognition, an acknowledgement he would never have been forced to face if she had shouted or fought or stormed away. Because her justice did not arrive as vengeance. It arrived as truth he could not argue with without betraying the very image of himself he had spent years crafting. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he lowered the microphone. His shoulders sagged just enough for those in the first few rows to notice, and he turned, not dramatically, not with a flourish, but with the tentative care of someone returning something fragile they had almost broken. "You're right," he said quietly. The words nearly swallowed by the vast ceiling, yet heard by every ear in the room because of the way the silence carried them. "You're right." He did not ask her to stay. He did not invite her to sing. He did not try to redeem himself with grand gestures. Instead, he stepped back, clearing the space around her, and in that small act, the balance of power in the theater reset. Not violently, not triumphantly, but just enough for the child in the spotlight to no longer stand there alone. Applause did not erupt. It rose slowly, uncertain at first, then steadier. Not celebratory, not explosive, but grateful, as if the room were thanking her for something they could not name. And as the sound swelled, gentle and reverent, it became clear to everyone present that the justice unfolding here was not the kind that humiliated or destroyed. It was the kind that restored, not only her dignity, but their own. When the applause finally softened, it did not fade the way applause usually does, dissolving into chatter and movement and the rustle of programs. Instead, it receded like a tide that chose to linger along the shore, leaving behind a hush that felt tender rather than empty, and in that hush, the girl remained where she was for a few seconds longer, not because anyone expected her to, but because she needed a breath to understand that the moment had ended without swallowing her. The man had stepped aside. The orchestra had settled into a posture that resembled rest more than readiness, and the audience, 500 people who had, moments earlier, been poised to witness something small and forgettable, now sat with their shoulders softened and their hands folded as if they were afraid to disturb the delicate shape of what had just been restored. A woman near the aisle wiped silently at the corner of her eye, not out of sadness, but out of the unfamiliar relief of seeing a wrong gently corrected without spectacle. The backstage staff member who had taken that tentative step forward earlier now lowered her arms and allowed herself a quiet, steady breath, as if some knot inside her own chest had also loosened. The girl glanced once more at the notebook in her hand, pressing her fingers against its worn cover with a care that resembled gratitude, then tucked it back into her pocket with the same gentleness she had always used, as though the words inside it were still alive and listening. The man met her gaze briefly, not for long, not with the elaborate sincerity of a public performance, but with a small human nod that carried no excuses, only acknowledgement, and then he turned away to address the room with a voice that sounded different, not because it was quieter, but because it had lost the thin layer of distance that had once covered it. He did not explain himself. He did not offer speeches about lessons, or growth, or perspective. He simply asked the audience to give the musicians a moment, his words careful and plain, and when he stepped back again, the conductor lifted his hand with a gentleness that suggested he, too, felt the weight of what had happened. The music that followed did not arrive like triumph or celebration. It flowed softly, almost reverently, filling the theater with a sound that did not try to overwrite the moment, but to honor the space it had created, and as the first notes rose, the girl stepped down from the stage, not escorted, not guided, simply allowed. People parted for her not out of awe, but out of respect, and when she returned to the row where her empty seat waited, she felt a warmth travel across the distance between her and the strangers who watched her pass, a warmth that did not claim her, did not turn her into a symbol, but recognized her as a person who had endured something most of them hoped they would have handled half as gracefully. Her mother reappeared at the end of the aisle moments later, breath caught halfway between fear and relief, her hands hovering as if unsure whether to reach out or let the girl's composure remain untouched, and when their eyes met, neither of them spoke, because words would have reduced what had happened into something smaller, and there was no need to name it yet. They sat together in silence for the rest of the performance, shoulders barely touching, sharing the kind of closeness that did not announce itself. And though the girl listened to the music as she had planned to when the night first began, it sounded different now. Not louder, not grander, but fuller, as if it had more room to move inside her chest. When the final piece ended and the audience rose to their feet with applause that belonged wholly to the musicians, the girl stood too, not hesitantly, not timidly, but as part of the whole, neither hidden nor singled out. And this time the light that swept across the room as people gathered their coats and belongings did not feel like a spotlight hunting for her, but like an ordinary glow she was allowed to exist within. Outside, the night air was cool and steady, the pavement still holding the faint warmth of the day, and as they walked down the steps of the theater, the girl and her mother heard fragments of conversation floating around them. Not loud, not intrusive, just small acknowledgments passed between strangers who now understood something about themselves that they hadn't when they first arrived. No one stopped the girl. No one asked for pictures. A few people glanced at her with soft eyes and a respectful distance, and that, more than any praise, felt like the truest kindness. Days later, when the brightness of the evening had been replaced by the familiarity of ordinary mornings and the rhythms of school and chores and quiet routines, a letter arrived at their small apartment, folded carefully inside an envelope whose return address belonged to the community arts program housed inside the same theater. It was not an invitation to perform, or to stand on another stage, or to become anything other than who she already was. It simply invited her to attend a weekly gathering, not as a curiosity, not as a lesson, but as a participant, someone whose presence was wanted, not demanded. The letter explained that they were beginning a series of open listening sessions, where people from the neighborhood could come and talk about what music and stories meant to them, where no one would be made to prove their worth by standing alone beneath a light. Her mother read it twice, then handed it to her without commentary, and the girl traced the printed lines with the tip of her finger, feeling again that small, steady knot of strength inside her, not tightening this time, but easing. On the first evening they attended, the building felt different than it had on the night of the performance. The doors seemed to open more gently, the echo in the hallways softer, the voices warmer in the way shared spaces sometimes become after they have been forced to confront themselves. The same violinist from the orchestra was there, seated on a folding chair without her instrument, listening with her hands folded loosely in her lap. A stagehand spoke quietly about long hours and unnoticed labor. An elderly man talked about the first concert he had ever attended as a boy, the way the sound had stayed with him long after the lights dimmed. No one stood in a spotlight. No one was asked to entertain. When it was her turn, or rather, when the circle simply allowed space to open near her, the girl did not recount what had happened that night on stage. She did not revisit the sharp moments or the trembling ones. She spoke instead about the hallway, the notebook, the way music had always felt like a place where people could breathe a little more easily, and the room listened, not because she was brave or extraordinary, but because they understood that listening was the simplest form of respect. When the evening ended and the chairs were stacked and the lights lowered, she lingered near the back of the room, running her fingers once more along the frayed edge of her notebook, and for the first time she did not feel as though she was guarding it. She felt as though it was resting, not finished, not closed, simply at peace. As she and her mother stepped out into the night, a breeze slipped down the street and lifted the corner of a poster taped to the theater wall, revealing a faint reflection of the two of them in the glass beside it. They paused for a moment, not to admire, not to remember, but to exist inside the simple, comforting truth that no one was watching them now. No one was testing them. No one was measuring their worth against the size of a stage. And in that quiet, ordinary stretch of sidewalk under a modest street lamp, the girl understood something she would carry with her long after childhood had grown into something else. Justice, when it comes gently, does not make anyone smaller, or louder, or grander. It simply returns people to their full size, and leaves behind a warmth that lingers like music long after the last note has faded.